Today on the podcast, I invited a friend of mine to go through Rawls's original thought experiment and to try to determine if we agreed with Rawls's original conclusion that if you were to work backward from a place of consensus among a bunch of different ideologies and thoughts of how things ought to be, you would come up with a system of society and government that is very consistent with what we actually see. The conversation has been edited slightly for brevity. I think that we were both very surprised with the results, and hopefully you will be too. With that, let's get into it. Just as a reminder, we want to go through the original position, so we're going to pretend that neither of us know who we are in society, know what we believe, know what we're raised to do, know our skills or abilities. We're playing D&D, and all of our stats are random, and we don't know what they are.
Right.
And we're going to work through and say, this is how I think government should operate, this is how I think society should operate, and we're going to work our way backward. And then we're going to role-play different people, and we're going to do the same thing.
I'm excited.
All right.
It's some real world building.
Yeah. All right, so we're gonna pretend that we're American. Okay, I don't want to go into the whole global government thing. There's a whole way to do that, and I am not prepared for it because I don't know how different cultures operate. I know our cultures in America.
Right, and just as well, if I'm already stripping away my identity and defining principles, I'd like to at least start with the geography I'm familiar with.
Yeah. So let's start with the ideology that each of us are familiar with, and then we will kind of expand out from there.
Oh, as in like just explain what we believe now before we get into the thought experiment, or just like starting from the void?
Yeah, we'll do the thought experiment, and we'll start from where we are today. So, for example, for me, right, I don't know who I'm going to be born as, but I assume that I am going to have a far leftist ideology. So I think it should be the case that no matter who I am born as, I have the opportunity and the means to survive and to live a comfortable life with as little human suffering as possible. I think that should be the ideal. The systems of government should be devised around my ability to speak my piece and make requests on my own behalf, and that others should not speak for me, just in case that I am one of the little dudes. But if I'm one of the super smart people who's born super rich, under my ideology, I would be comfortable with bits of my resources being used to bring everybody else up, even if it means that I don't get to be super rich as a result. Right? So there's just like an example.
That tracks. And I think if I understand this first question, my answer would be something like, in thinking about this entire field of thought, the defining ideology for me is my Catholic faith.
Okay.
Not in the like strict control of social doctrine way, but more so in that inherent idea that you should always have hope, you should always have faith in a better tomorrow, you should always want your fellow man to flourish, you should want to care for the lowest in society, because by being a servant is how you are made great. Humbling yourself exalts yourself. That sort of idea. So if I'm taking this question in the way that I think you intend, where my brain goes is very similar to you. I imagine that when I am born, what I want is to have my basic needs met. I want to make sure that I can eat when I'm hungry, I can drink when I'm thirsty, I want to have shelter, I want to have ways to protect myself from the elements, clothe myself against the elements, and I want to make sure that I can be cared for when I am sick or injured. And to that spirit, I want to make sure that my society is in a place where those needs of myself and my neighbors are always met. Because when those needs are not met in my neighbors, that's what leads to strife and to conflict and to violence.
Yeah.
So I want a system of government that ensures that I'm safe, I'm cared for, I'm protected, and I have the ability to grow in the ways that I choose.
Okay. I'm going to drive a wedge between us, right? And
okay.
Feel free to disagree, because that's part of the thought experiment.
You got it.
I am worried that in a society where people have free access to private property, that what will happen is people with more private property will edge me out, and I will not be able to even ask for my needs to be met. And therefore, the amount of private property that anyone can own ought to be limited.
Perhaps. I think there's a minor schism between those two. On one hand, I would disagree that private property is inherently flawed in and of itself. I think the bigger thing that you're combating with is greed and that idea that we want things in excess. I think we would both agree that it's not a problem if you and I each own our own homes. The problem is when I believe that my home takes up all of yours and you shouldn't have one. So the question would be, what do we do in those cases, assuming that we're born as you put it, not one of the big ones?
It sounds like we don't align completely because the whole issue of private property more largely, I think, inevitably ends in a consequence where somebody owns all of the homes. But that's okay. That's part of the thought experiment. So
Perhaps.
I'm gonna shift my position a little bit. Okay.
All right.
First, before I shift my position, let me add one of the things that I think is necessary is, again, free expression of ideas. People should be able to believe what they believe, think what they think, and say what they want to say because, in case I'm the little guy, that benefits me.
Yes, I would agree with that. You always need to have, everyone needs to have a voice, especially if you're not going to be in a position of power.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So now I'm going to shift positions a little bit. I am me, except I'm a militant atheist. That's just
Okay.
part of who I am. You shouldn't have the right to say whatever you want to say.
Go on with that. I don't. Would that be the militant atheist perspective, or I guess like what you mean by that is they want to aggressively push deist thinking out.
Yeah, because the thought process is that deist thinking will necessarily distract people from the material problems and needs that exist, and therefore will prevent that egalitarian society from developing.
Okay, so censorship becomes a requirement.
Yep,
Okay, carry on.
that's the only addition. Original me rejects that premise, but we're adding militant atheist in, and militant atheist thinks that there should not be speech rights.
So this is where I think things get interesting from the void. And my assumption here is that when you set up a censorship culture, the equal and opposite reaction is to create a resistance ideology that will eventually bubble up to conflict. For instance, in your culture of military atheism, the idea that you're suppressing is deist thinking. So people become private deists and they use that escape mentalism to create a identity separate from what the society is trying to engender. So ultimately, you have two mutually exclusive ideologies that I think inevitably come to blows.
Yep.
So the question would be, how do you create a system of government in the society that allows multiple viewpoints to exist, and yet none of them to come into open violent conflict while still furthering the needs of the state?
And I would agree. So I think using the militant atheist example, we can prove pretty conclusively that freedom of association and of speech are necessary to avoid violent conflict in the long term in order to maintain a just society in the long term.
I would agree so too. And it's a good conjecture, right? Like, obviously, there's more information that we haven't considered. On top of it, though, circling a little bit back to the private property idea, I think within freedom of speech is this whole idea of freedom of expression. And the tricky part there is, where do you draw the line? Like, for instance, in the culture that we have now in the United States, there are certain expressions that we can't do. And I don't mean like political correctness. I mean things like, we know that you can't run into a crowded space and express yourself by yelling, fire, fire, everybody run for their life. We know that you can't make certain choices as a member of society that cause violence or harm to your neighbors purely because that's what you believe. Those are crimes and those are cordoned off.
All
So
right.
I guess my question to all this is, how do you create safe self-expression where safety in and of itself does put limits on what a person ought to be able to do?
I'm gonna
Does that make sense?
I'm gonna shift my ideology again.
Okay.
I am a QAnon Trump supporter. I'm putting on all the hats, man. I'm gonna I'm gonna
It's a
offend
red
your and
one.
my
It's a fog on it.
sensibilities. It's
Go for it. Go for it.
all right. So QAnon hat. So
Yes.
in normal times, I agree with you. But so here's the thing: this system of governance that you all have agreed to, I don't agree to it, and it's harming me and my people, and our way of life is being impacted. And I am terrified that I am not going to be allowed to be in a few years, and you have left me no out other than political violence. Give me another
Yeah.
out.
The interesting thing to put a footnote on is I would make the argument that QAnon is a precursor to war culture. to accept the tenets of QAnon as I understand them, and as not a QAnon supporter, I will confess my understanding is limited. But the basic tenets that I understand are that the ruling class of Democrats is involved in a barbaric, satanic culture that is an affront to human decency, dignity, and the American way of life. And therefore, to not be violently against it is to be complicit in it. And therefore, violence is the only answer when confronted with such apparent evil. With the QAnon culture, I almost think that that is the manifestation of a society already gone tragically wrong. So it's difficult for me to shake them into the void. Does that make sense?
It does. The question then becomes, I am a QAnon supporter. How do we redefine society such that my political violence no longer becomes necessary? And I have a thought on this, and you may not like
Go
this
for it.
thought.
No, go for that thought first.
My thought on this is that if I am a QAnon supporter, I am terrified that there are immoral people operating in the highest levels of government and that they are not accountable to me or mine. What those levels of government are needs to shrink down. They need to be way less powerful. And they need to be so much less powerful that they are actually accountable at a local level.
Okay. I think where that inevitably runs into an obstacle with the thought experiment would be in my original thesis. I was like, hey, look, in order for me as a big guy, little guy, anywhere in between in this no idea of where I fit in society, my government needs to be able to provide for my basic needs. And the hope would be that the government is strong enough to prevail in times where I, as an individual, couldn't. If I can't get food on my own, the government can help me find it. If I can't protect myself from this threat, the government is strong enough to stand in its way. The tools that are necessary to enable a government to do that are the same mechanisms that a QAnon supporter would be afraid of. For instance, it's hard to imagine a government that could keep me safe as a little guy if they didn't have some sort of military arm to protect us, or at least fortifications to protect us, or something. Those things are the things that QAnon people seem to rebel against.
Yeah, well, but so if I'm even just a conservative, right? I'm going to shift positions again. Maybe I'll get back to QAnon later, maybe I don't. If I'm even just a conservative, right, I look at your system of government and I say, no, the premise should not be human suffering, okay? Humans have always suffered. Humans are always going to suffer. The premise should be individual rights. And my right to the outcomes of my labor and my right to representation outweighs your demand to reduce your own suffering. It outweighs your demand to some portion of the material goods that are produced in the country. I own that. That is mine, and you have no right to step on it.
That sounds about right for the conservative mindset. Like, hey, I am entitled to the fruit of my labor. And if you don't have that fruit, it means you didn't do the necessary labor. Therefore, why should you be entitled to what I have made? That's a trickier one, too, because to some extent, I do believe that idea is healthy.
Well, I want to back up just for the purpose of the thought. It doesn't matter if it's healthy or not.
Yeah.
Right? This is something that people
there's
believe.
more to that, but go on.
Yeah. This is something that people believe. So government and the society more broadly has to be shaped in such a way that these people also don't go into violent rebellion.
True. And my thinking there, which is what I meant by the healthy comment, is I think if you give someone in the society something to build toward, that they know they couldn't create on their own. For instance, I believe that in this society, the government has an ability to protect us in a way that an individual does not. One person cannot fight off an enemy army. Maybe they can delay them, maybe they can annoy them, but at the end of the day, army versus army is how we stay safe from foreign foes. Therefore, if these conservative elements in this void society believe that by contributing their treasure, i.e. taxes, by making a donation of their time, i.e. enlisting, that they are using the fruits of their labor to create something that is broader than they could create on their own, I would hope they would still be satisfied.
I have yet to meet or speak to a conservative that doesn't believe that we should have no army. I think from...
Right.
At least in this country, I think the most conservative that people get is to say that it's more the social programs that should kind of disappear.
Right.
So I think natural protection, is there any group that we can conceive of who has a stake in the way that the country is run who would not agree that the government should provide for the military protection, if nothing else, military protection of everyone?
My in like stretching the limits of my imagination, it would almost be a conscientious objector culture. I don't know if that corresponds to a certain religious sect or a certain way of life or group, but the only group that I can imagine would be someone who is like, violence in and of itself is abhorrent, and that we must go with the flow of society, even if that means new ways of life are enforced upon us. And again, this isn't a profile group, it's just based on my limited understanding. I imagine a group like the Pennsylvania Amish or like the Quakers, this idea that we are conscientious objectors to violence. We would rather free ourselves of the responsibility of violently shaping world affairs to instead just trust and have hope that we will always be well. Does that make sense?
It does. What I think we can do for those folks is we can create or carve out exemptions where they don't have to pay in or they don't have to contribute to the system of government, except insofar as it provides them legal protections, but not necessarily military protections, right?
Well, that's where it gets tricky, right? Because geographically, if they're within the borders of our society, an attack on them would be an attack on the whole.
But let me shift the thinking a little bit, okay?
Uh,
Say that I am born poor. It would be the case that if somebody were to invade and destroy all of our structure and infrastructure and all of that, that doesn't impact me all that much. You know what I mean? Like, my needs are already not being met, and my needs will continue to not be met. And, like, from a Maslow's hierarchy perspective, I am in no better or worse a position, regardless of who is running the thing. If I'm Amish,
Perhaps.
I'm intentionally poor. That's just part of how I operate.
I more so mean from a geography standpoint. So imagine that we're in the United States.
Yeah.
Let's pretend, for instance, just for simplicity's sake, that the entirety of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is this conscientious objector Amish territory. Like, that's just the entirety of the Commonwealth. If a foreign power attacks that Commonwealth, and occupies all of its territory because there's no resistance. Like, if our culture has said, hey, look, we'll protect you legally, we'll protect you socially, but we won't protect you militarily because you've opted out. All of a sudden, as a society, we now have one part of our landmass occupied by a foreign power. And that is a detriment to our society as a whole if we didn't strive to defend those folks underneath our banner.
So, even though there are folks that don't want to be protected, there are enough folks that believe that we ought to protect them anyway, that it still makes sense to have that military protection for them. But I guess my question is, would it be a just society or system of government if we forced them to pay for the bit of protection that they never asked for?
That's the question, because that makes me wonder about a resistance ideology. And that's where it gets sticky. And that's why, as I'm trying to go back in my head to basics, it's like no matter who I am born as and what my ideology is in the void, I want to be cared for my needs, and I want to be protected. Those are the two things that I would look for in a society, whether I was a big guy, little guy, or anybody in between. I want cared for and protected. The question becomes, if someone else is being harmed, is it a part of protecting myself to defend them?
Let me think through that a little bit, because that, I think, proposes an interesting question. So if I have a conservative ideology, they ought not be harmed. We ought to have a legal system that protects them from that harm. We ought to have a military system that protects them from outside harm. But if the suffering is self-inflicted, then they ought to deal with it.
Yes, and I think the analogy that pops into my head, and this does bring up the private property thing, which I know we have a schism on, and that's okay. But the analogy that I thought of was, hey, we all live on this street. My neighbor never locks their doors, doesn't hide their valuables, and is constantly making everyone know that they have things of value. If robbers then try to take the goods from their home violently, my fear as a conservative would be that robber is learning how to do it better to then take the stuff that I have earned and made for myself next. Therefore, I should stop the robber before they rob the house next door, even though the house next door is doing things that open themselves up to harm. Does that follow?
It does, and so thinking that even more thoroughly, if I'm rich, I want to protect my stuff, and I want government to protect my stuff. If I'm poor, I want to be protected from the rich, and I want the little that I have to be protected both from the rich and from government. I think that we can establish pretty universally a conception that we ought to have laws on the books that protect from violence from the other.
Right. I think the primary thing is we are going to strongly discourage people from the act of taking property, taking a life, taking someone's wealth, taking someone's spouse or child, like in the case of like adultery or kidnapping. We want to make sure that one party cannot take from the other without their consent. That plays into, I think, every ideology we've brought up so far, from the QAnon supporter to the liberal to the conservative. The idea is like, I have my stuff, I have my people, I have my loved ones, and you shouldn't be able to take that from me.
Yep.
That is mine, and it's important for me to have them.
So let me add a twist to that, though. If I
Uh,
create a contract with you that says you will do X, Y, and Z thing, and you consent to this contract, and part of the contract says if you do not do X, Y, and Z thing, I get to take your home, I get to take your stuff. Is that acceptable?
I feel yes because of the consent. It's kind of like, hey, we as government will provide a service, and this is the cost of the service. You consent, therefore you understand the terms. What I'm speaking to is more of like, in the case of a robbery or a murder or an assault or any of those crimes, what's happening there is without your consent, something is being done unto you. And that's where the crime comes from.
Let me put my socialist hat on for a second here.
Okay.
I disagree. So I think that because there are basic needs that must be met by every human person in society, that consent can never be achieved. Because what happens is, let's say that I need to provide food, right? For myself, for my
Mhm.
family, what have you. If there is a big guy, if there's a rich guy, right?
Mhm.
Then that rich guy can deny food to me unless I sign a consensual contract that says I will pay a bazillion jillion dollars for this food. And if I don't, if I'm not able to pay it in like a year, then they get all my stuff and I am a servant forever.
I see what you're saying, like coercion.
Yeah. So the problem
Oh,
is that there are human needs which act as coercive elements. So their consent has to be better defined than just consent.
true.
If I am a rich conservative, to me, socialism and this idea that I can't form free contracts would be abhorrent.
Ah, okay. I concede that point. Yes, you're correct.
So
That would be abhorrent under that ideology.
at least today, while we have people that find that abhorrent, a socialist ideology would not be just.
Well, I don't know if I blanket agree with that.
Today, given that there are people that feel that free association between people is more important than and individual rights are more important than anything else, than the sense of community or that everybody's needs be met, right? There is no
Mm-hmm.
consensus that a system like socialism could work or could be just. Maybe in the future, if people change, if ideologies change, maybe.
Hmm. Yes, that seems to track to me. It's like in a society where the individual's needs and rights and beliefs are more important than the collective success of the whole, something like socialism couldn't take.
So I see two factions now. There's a faction that is maximal individual rights, or not even maximal, they're willing to make concessions. And there's a side that is maximum community benefit. Where's the middle ground?
I think the middle ground rests somewhere in a mutual understanding of all parties of what a human needs to survive in society. So, I don't think anybody in any ideology would believe that human beings don't need food. In some of the ideologies with a little bit more, or a lot of it more prejudice and, racism and divisive thinking, there are people that you don't want to care for, but we all realize that human beings as creatures have basic needs. So I think the compromise comes from having an understanding of what those needs are and how society will provide for those needs, and then building off of it.
So let me play the conservative again.
Mm-hmm.
You are responsible for providing your own needs. I am not responsible for that.
Right. However, you understand as a conservative that by not providing for the needs of your neighbor, i.e., the robbery of my neighbor's house analogy, myself can come under threat if others are not cared for.
Okay.
So, whether it's from fear or compulsion or altruism, I want to make sure that everybody else has at least some stuff so they don't come after my stuff. In the conservative ethos that I'm familiar with, yeah, they don't want to buy their neighbor a TV or a car, but they want to make sure their neighbor isn't living on the street.
Okay. So in the interest of preventing unrest, I am willing, as a conservative, I am willing to create some positive rights in the interest of protecting my stuff. So I have two choices
Right.
now that I think through it, right? I have two choices. I can either say, no, I am sticking to my guns, I'm gonna have maximum individual rights, there's nothing that you can do about it, and the poor will literally eat the rich. I don't want that.
Right.
So I have to agree to some level of positive rights.
Right. There has to be some level of societal protection to care for the needs and the needs and safety of every citizen.
Brief aside, apologies for the typing. I'm listing out all of the things that we've kind of conceded must exist in government.
I would wonder if people that were living under like a medieval hegemon or living under some sort of monarchy or dictatorship might trend towards a different philosophy. I do believe there are a lot of things that the current system of government does get right, and the issues come from the complexity.
So I think that's something worth considering. So I think it is the case that because we have so many resources, that is a concession that the rich would be willing to make. But if it were the case, so if it were the case that we didn't have 30% more food than we needed as a country, even after exports, then I could see a more rich conservative saying, no, 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 meeting your rights or needs, creating positive rights, would necessarily put my own well-being at risk. Where today in our country there's so much wealth that putting someone else's well-being at risk isn't a thing, and so that
Mhm.
compromise or that trade becomes more palatable.
That's a very interesting point to consider. The idea that the consequences of denying your neighbor in a country as rich as the modern United States isn't a question of their survival. It is, but it doesn't appear that way. Therefore, we're more willing to advocate for barbarism than we would be if we were in a society where scarcity was a prevailing factor.
I'm thinking through, like, if we redo that bit of the thought experiment, and I don't want to backtrack too far, but if we do redo that bit
That's
of the
right.
thought experiment, but we set it up in, I don't know, 1850s society. If you said to me, a rich person, that I needed to ensure that the poors were fed, I would say no, because if I do that, I will starve, and maybe they'll get violent. But if the choices are between me starving and dying, or them getting violent and me dying, I'm going to take the risk and just keep my stuff.
Right. Well, I think that's a reasonable assumption. I don't think there's a world where you can predicate it upon I will starve so my neighbor will live. But then again, that might just be my American individualism coming out.
Yeah.
I think if you came down to it, consider like the human being as a creature, like an animal creature. We will always, whether big guy, little guy, or in between, we will always want to feed ourselves and our immediate circle first. Like we want to care for them first. That's the basis of all tribalism.
But then as the amount of resources that are available expands, our tribe expands, not because it necessarily must, because it's beneficial to us, because feeding them means that they won't kill us in our sleep.
Right. And also, feeding them means that I am more protected because I'm surrounded by people that are strong, well fed, and healthy. They can fight for me to protect me. They can fight alongside me against enemies. They can help me in the case of a natural disaster. Like they have the literal strength to help me out of problems.
Now you're describing more of kind of a liberal ideology, right? Or even like neoliberal in like the Reaganist sense, where you intentionally reinvest in the society because doing so makes you materially better off. So what that looks like is you agree to pay taxes for the construction of roads because the construction of roads will allow you to make more money and more products and more stuff for yourself than you could have without roads.
Tracking on that. That makes sense to the conservative that I imagine.
If that investment grows to be too large, the benefit or return that I see to myself decreases. And so there's a maximum amount that I am willing to invest into the society, and it is based upon how much return that I can get, and that is going to vary by the individual.
Right. Because it becomes a function of how much can I attain from my investment. What's my ROI?
As a poor person, I don't care about your ROI. I just
Right.
want to make sure I can live.
Right. Here is a possible twist. I think one of the key differences in our thought experiment versus reality is I don't believe, or my understanding is that the current government structure does not provide for the physical needs of all of its citizens. And that's the issue. People are up in arms because they don't have affordable housing, they don't have access to safe and healthy food, they don't have the ability to get their basic needs met. And also they don't feel protected. They live in a society where the protectors are violent, especially if you have darker skin tones, where foreign enemies can still attack and harm you, and that fear is manifest. So I would say that in our thought experiment, one thing we can't take for granted is what if that government was succeeding in providing for all those things? How would society be shaped otherwise?
So here's something to consider. And again, I'm playing a conservative. It is not the government's place to ensure racial equality. It would be racist for the society to disproportionately benefit you on account of your race, even if there are historical inequities that have existed. Those are irrelevant, right? Because
Because it wasn't us.
it
It
was
was it was back then.
right. It wasn't us. It was back then, and you can live by your own means today. And the fact that I had more is fine because again, I'm trying to maximize for personal freedom, and you are fed, you are clothed, you have nothing to complain about. Your material needs are largely met, and if they're not, we have food stamps and SNAP and Medicare and Medicaid, and it's not perfect, but it's better than nothing.
That's where it comes back to in that the middle ground compromise we talked about was society has to have a mutual understanding of what it means to care for a human being. And I think what we're seeing is in our society, the different ideologies just fundamentally disagree on what a person survive. Like, yeah, we know food, but when it comes to healthcare, what is the right amount of healthcare, in quotes, to care for a person? How much should it cost? Should it cost anything? Who should it be accessible to within a country's boundaries?
Well,
Those are things that we just fundamentally disagree on amongst the ideologies, and that's the conflict.
so but remember though, the only reason that I even agreed to this in the first place is because if I didn't, you were going to eat me, right? And
Oh,
so
okay.
the amount of healthcare that you get, like where that line ought to be, it's fine where it is. As long as you are not in a position where you are going to literally eat me.
I see. Okay. Okay.
But I think what I'm understanding is that unless and until the broad population starts to express or display violence against the system and against its progenitors, then
Hmm.
we're at the right place. Until the system becomes violent, the compromise that we have currently is acceptable to people. Would you agree?
I would agree with that. I think that hits the nail on the head. The absence of violence is like the homeostasis to keep society intact.
Okay. We have a test now. We can know we've gone too far some direction when people start to get violent.
Yes, because while there have been societies in the past that have prized violence as a way of life, history has shown that those societies all either vanished or changed and never became the sustainable future. And I know that's a simplistic view, but it just reinforces the test that we've created.
So, what was your other point?
So the other point was going to be just in speaking about the situation with Black Lives Matter, who watches the Watchmen in terms of law enforcement being perpetrators. The point I was going to bring up was just in our test and in this world of watching for violence. We know we have a problem as society when law enforcement, as agents of our government, are violating the original social contracts of protection that we put in place, right? Like in the conservative ethos that I've heard countless times from profess it is, oh, well, if those people were following the law, they would be fine. But the reality of it is, so often, all too often, you have people that aren't violating the law, but are being met with lethal force. And that is a problem when agents of the government have the wanton ability to inflict lethal violence upon others with no repercussions. Like that is still violence in the society and then also fails our test.
So, I think that that speaks to a deeper problem, and I think that what we've seen, especially recently with Black Lives Matter, and what we've seen even with QAnon, I would argue, is a place where the compromise and the agreement that we have as a society is breaking down because groups that were minorities, or even groups that are minorities, their voices are being amplified by people who are not. And what that means is when you see violence against a particular minority, there's a group of people that say this system is incapable of maintaining protection and has not achieved homeostasis. It must be altered. And those people appear to have no voice and feel that they have no voice. The society is not constructed in such a way that their needs are being met, that their need to be heard is being met, and so they are resorting to violence. And on the other hand of that, we've got the QAnon folks who feel, in the same token, that their needs are not being met, that they are not being heard, and the result of that is political violence as well. So, what in our system is wrong? Where has our consensus gone wrong that we have this violence arising?
I think that in those cases, we have to roll back to the basics of, hey, we're formed in the void. We have no identity. What does it mean to be human? And I think one of the things that human is that when you don't feel heard, when you don't feel like your ideas can be expressed and understood, violence is your expression. Because at the end of the day, violence is just eliminating someone with a contrary idea so that your idea can triumph. Right? That's kind of what war is. And so we can get on that rabbit hole if we want, but at the end of the day, it is a human thing. We can't separate the fact that someone will get violent if they're put in the pressure cooker so long of not having their ideas heard and recognized.
So,
It's not to say that their ideas can go unchallenged. It's just to say that if people are ignored, it will inevitably ferment into violence out of frustration.
so then it sounds like part of our society ought to be that people, even minorities, ought to have a voice in whatever the system of government is. And so it ought not be the case that tyranny of the majority or even tyranny of the plurality can exist.
That would be the challenge, yes. I think you're right in that.
Okay.
A government that allows for some sort of self expression in current affairs.
All right. So what we need to do is we need to ensure that individual cultures, states, we'll call them, should be represented, but then also so that we don't have tyranny of the minority, that people should be represented, but then also to make sure that we don't have too much sway of the majority, that minority groups ought to explicitly be represented. Would you agree?
Broadly speaking, yes, but I would disagree in some of the nuances. I just don't have them all thought out yet to speak.
Well,
So please proceed.
the system that I'm conceiving, and this is at a federal level, and we could drop down. So at the broadest level, geographical
Mm.
regions should have representation, just as a region, right? That's my culture. Those are my people. We have representation. We don't all agree, but we have representation. Under that, portions of the population have representation. I'm not necessarily advising the Senate and House model necessarily. I'm just saying there ought
Yeah.
to be representation by population and representation by geographic region, and those two ought to be held in some kind of balance such that the majority population cannot overwhelm the minority region, but the minority region cannot overwhelm the majority population.
Yes. So it would make sense that I have representation as a geographical region because those are the people that live with me. They're closest to me, whether they are literally my tribe or not. A person in California, in this case, needs to have representation from California that is different from my representation across the country at the other coast. You should be represented by people in your community because they know the needs of your community uniquely. And it would make sense that in a world that inevitably has finite resources, as we get bigger and bigger as a country and as a society, there need to be more levels of people to enable the fair and thorough distribution of resources to the populations across the fiefdom, if you will, across the state. So, yes to all, I think so far.
Okay, so we have division of labor, right? We understand division of labor is the most efficient way to ensure that the most people's needs are met.
I think that's true. I don't think anybody would disagree with that because it helps society optimize.
Yeah. So part of that division of labor ought to be that political decisions, while they are made on my behalf, are something that, and I'm speaking for myself, right? I
Hmm.
don't know all of the nuances of how each individual regulation ought to operate, and so it should be the case that there is someone who represents me, but, and this is a big but, if there is going to be representation, it ought to be the case that I specifically feel that I am represented, and not just the case that I get to, quote, choose, unquote, my representative, whether or not they actually represent me.
I think I understand the problem you're speaking to. And I think that's a tricky one because, on one hand, yeah, it would be great that everyone felt that they were ideally represented. And I do believe that's what a democratic republic is meant to do. But there are practical issues that we confront that we haven't overcome. Because at the end of the day, let me dial back a bit.
Yeah.
In this society, is the state able to conscript those that they believe are most suited for public office? For instance, what I mean by that is, I think one of the fundamental problems we have in our American republic is people can only be elected who want to run for office, and therefore we get a certain type of people who want that power and that influence for themselves, whether altruistically or selfishly. We only have a certain subset of people who are willing to run for office. I think we would both know people in our lives who would make great governors, statesmen, congressmen, presidents, but they would never, ever, ever, ever run because they have no interest in playing that game. To put it very simply, and this is probably an oversimplification, I am certain that there are farmers out there that would probably make better agriculture secretaries or folks to advocate for agricultural policy than the people who seek out a life and career politics. So, does the state have a mechanism to inspire or compel those people to step up to protect the state based on the talents and ideas that they have?
So this is an interesting point. Okay, so first of all, we need everybody's voices to be heard, so it's some form of democracy, whether that's direct democracy or representative democracy or what have you, right? Some form of democracy. Would we agree so far?
Agreed.
Okay. And then we have, on top of that, probably representative democracy specifically because of the division of labor, right? Where we want somebody who is going to qualify as an expert in drafting and passing laws or provisions or what have you. Still with me?
Still with you.
Okay. And then on top of that, the people that ought to be making or helping to inform those laws, because even the politicians can't be an expert on every subject, ought to be local representatives from that sector, as opposed to prescriptive representatives that are meant to represent everybody in totality. So instead of us having one Secretary of Energy, it ought to be the case that each individual community is represented by a Secretary of Energy that represents them.
Okay, yes, but also no, and I would push back a little bit here.
Okay.
So, assuming that you're building off of the point that I just made, I would twist your interpretation a little bit. Like, I don't have a problem with there being undersecretaries of energy across the various states underneath the country state. That to me makes sense. That to me is something that could work. My point is more so about the qualifications of the individuals holding the office. So, what I mean by that is sort of like how there's division of labor, as in like the people that are most skilled or have an inclination for a certain type of work get to do that type of work and society benefits. It shouldn't just be the people who want to be in charge are in charge. It should be the people that are best suited to be in charge, the best suited to serve. So the example in my head is someone like, hey, we have a Nobel laureate economics professor. They have no desire to run for office, but they really should be the ones writing economic policy for the nation. Should the state have a mechanism by which that individual can be conscripted into government service for a time?
So that sounds very prescriptive, and so I'm going to put my socialist hat on again because it's my favorite hat.
Go for it. It looks very nice with the snow backdrop today.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I want to be able to define who is going to make those policy decisions for me, whether you think they're the best person for the job or not.
Okay. So the state can't just hand pick them, because in that could lie corruption inevitably.
Right. Even though I would agree with you that it should necessarily be people who don't want it. Like, that's the absolute best way to choose a leader, is to find somebody who doesn't want the power. But first of all, it's not feasible. And second of all, then you're being prescriptive, and my voice is unheard, and we are back to square one.
Let's take our economics professor. Is there such a way that it could be like, hey, look, what incentives would we have to provide to them to get their name on a ballot to serve? Because you're right, we still have to have our democracy in place. So if folks are... I almost wonder if there needs to be maybe this is just how democracy is meant to function and we just don't do it. Like, when we go to the ballot box, we have the ability to select someone. So maybe the issue is that we're just selecting people that are... Maybe the current system is the very system we're trying to create, but failed. To rewind to make this all make sense. In a democracy, even in modern real America, when I walk into the ballot box, I can put anyone's name on my ballot for a position. I can write them in.
Yep.
Ideally, if my society was operating in a way that I genuinely knew who the leaders in the community were, who had the right ideas, right being ones that benefit our society, in my perspective, I should be able to write their name down carte blanche. But instead, in our modern America, one of the failures is we have two political powers that tell us who those people are, and then we pick between the two of them because we just let them do all the legwork for the worse. Does that all make sense? I just covered a lot of things in that rant.
It does, and we know why that's happened. We know that the current system that we have, first past the post, will optimize for a two-party system. It just will. It's just, there's mathematics to prove that. So we finally, I think, have found somewhere where the current system is not logical and is not a consensus agreement. We've done it. We did it. We did it. We proved that
Ta-da!
the original position doesn't create our current system of government. But what system of government does it create? So here's what I think. I think it ought to be the case, right? Just based on everything that we've discussed and the fact that you have to account for minority opinions to prevent violence, right? You have to account for majority
Correct.
opinions to prevent violence. You have to account for regional differences to prevent violence. You have to make sure the poor guy, the conservative guy, the rich guy, the black guy, that everybody's needs are accounted for. You have some kind of representative democracy, because again, division of labor.
Hmm.
You represent regionally, you represent locally, you represent majoritarily. I don't have a word for that.
Go for it. Keep going.
You let your representatives choose experts, and if you don't like the experts that they choose, you choose new representatives. But here's where I think the system differs. There's two places that I think the system differs. The executive that
Okay.
we have today is a system that ensures that at least half the people will be unhappy.
I think in the most recent elections that's true. I don't feel like that was always the case, but go on.
So division is possible, right? Agree? Division is in ideology is
Division will
possible.
always, yeah, division will always be possible.
Okay, so we need to make sure that that is accounted for. And I think that the way that we account for that is that we say that it must be the case that we have upper echelons of power, or any echelon of power, that does not create a situation where only one group's voice can be heard.
Yes. Okay.
So, what I am proposing is that instead of having an executive branch at all, we would have more of a parliamentarian system. And the reason that that is that everyone's representatives, the people that represent them, then go on to choose who will direct the different groups or organizations when efficiency is necessary. So, military operations, having that decided by a parliament is not going to work. You need a guy, right? Or a gal.
Yeah, you need a single individual.
Yeah, and so that individual in the chain of command that belongs to them ought to be fluid and flexible so it can change as rapidly as necessary, and also ought to be responsible ultimately to the body politic and not representative of one group's view. Even if that means that occasionally we are paralyzed, that will force us to compromise. So, what I'm envisioning is a prime minister almost that must be selected by like 2/3 of representatives.
Go on.
And the idea is if 2/3 can't agree, we'll come to a point where everything will grind to a halt. Some enemy will attack us, and we know that that's a risk, and we will be forced to compromise. And the result of that compromise is that instead of half of all people being upset, a third will. And it's still not acceptable, but it will prevent violence.
So I understand what you're saying, and it's not that your points have an erroneous conclusion. I just want to push back on one of the original assumptions, which
Mm-hmm.
is that in a two-party system, it necessitates that 50% of the public will always be disappointed. I understand the parliamentary system in the world of it would seem to enable more ideas to come to light because right now in our two-party system, we've got two things that paint with a broad brush. We've got the Democratic Party that mostly seems to be the liberal ideology, leaves the socialists wanting, and then we have the conservative movement that broadly seems to be the QAnon neo-Nazi mentality with some smatterings of the old conservative idealism inside, and those viewpoints are not palatable to the American whole, which is why we have the disengagement in the political system, and therefore we have people that are even more extreme coming onto the scene because that's the only way to build a coalition now. All of that is to say, I think, could a two-party system work with more cohesive leaders, or will it always be doomed to polarization?
And that's the thing. I think that it will always be doomed to polarization. And I want to back up. I don't necessarily want to build this system off of entirely observed phenomenon, although that would be good to do. I want to build it off of what would be acceptable to me as a person given those observed phenomena, right? And so I'm going to put my QAnon hat back on and say it is completely unacceptable to me that my choices were Donald Trump and Joe Biden. However, Joe Biden is literally the devil.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I even wonder if the QAnon thought would be it's unacceptable to anybody but Donald Trump, the only person who is saving us from the Satanist cannibals.
Sure, there's an ideology out there that I could pick that would represent that Donald Trump is a compromise that I am making, and that Joe Biden was literally the devil. That's I want to throw that aside. Let's
Sure.
throw the
Okay.
label aside.
Okay. Fine. For the point of the conversation, sure. 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 Sure.
So, because that has turned out to be the case, I think that a just system of government would be one in which I get to select a representative that represents me, who shares power with whoever that big top guy leader happens to be, even if that big top guy leader is a first among equals. And I think that that de-escalates a little bit, so that instead of so much power being wielded in one office or by one person, it is wielded more broadly, and my representative can at any time say, I no longer agree to this coalition, we need a government change.
What about something like a triumvirate? And I don't just mean like a split up of judiciary, legislative, and executive. I mean, like, what if we didn't have one leader, but three leaders with defined responsibilities? And I say three; it could be any odd number. I just think three because it's the lowest odd number that's greater than one. I'm trying to picture a world where it'd be like, hey, you could prevent the country from feeling devastated and unheard if you had three people in the position because they could counteract each other. Does that make any sense?
It does, but I still think that power is too closely held. And I would be okay with the three if it were in a parliamentarian system. I think that the broader point that I'm trying to make is that the parliamentarian system protects us from this tyranny of the majority that people are afraid of or worried about. Because if it comes to be the case that more elected representatives are not comfortable with the direction that the country is heading, they can at any time say, no confidence. And we don't have a prime minister, as it were, until there is confidence. It prevents this kind of split down the middle partisan problem that we're experiencing.
My concern is, we still see parliamentary systems fail and strong men, women, autocrats take power out of a parliamentary system. So I have concerns about the parliamentary system from how I've seen them fail in a way that I haven't seen American democracy fail yet. It's
So,
teetered a few times.
mhm.
It's been dangerous, but I don't believe that we've gotten to that level of utter failure under this system.
In order to fix that, and let me put my anarchist hat on now, we need a system of government that can detach from the broader system of government at any time. And what I mean by that is the federal government ought to be weak. The state government ought to be slightly stronger. The county government ought to be stronger still. My local government ought to be even stronger than that. And my direct community, the 100 or so people that I interact with every day, ought to really make the social decisions more broadly.
I disagree.
Okay?
Because our original thesis was that a government must be able to provide for my protection and my needs. If each individual city mayor is the prime authority in our state, there is no means by which any organization can prevent me or protect me from the neighboring mayor in the neighboring county, right?
Idea,
Because they all,
yeah.
So basically, what I think inevitably what happens there is like you have the warlord of Frederick County, who then wages war on the warlord of Montgomery County, Maryland, because the only way to protect Frederick was to take out Montgomery County, and then the only way to protect the counties of Maryland is to take out the counties of Delaware, et cetera, et cetera. I think you need a strong central government to make sure that the systems run to care for the needs and safety of the citizen
So,
across the board.
so the
The
problem,
government, the federal government sets the threshold
so
and enforces.
so the problem with a top-down approach, which is the approach that you're proposing, the problem with a top-down approach is that no matter how you organize that top level, me as a being in my community who only gets a little bit of say in what that top level government does, I am going to feel like I am not represented.
Well, and so this becomes the conundrum. You feel like you are not represented based on who is in the office representing. Like I think the bigger question becomes: do you feel like your government doesn't represent you at all, as in your government is so out of touch with your needs that they have to be ignored, i.e., a QAnon or anarchist? Or do you believe that your government works, but the people that are in it are bad, i.e., a liberal, a socialist, a MAGA hat wearer, a conservative right now in the Biden administration?
What we've concluded so far is that the government and the society that we have now is definitively, we can prove it, the result of compromises that different groups have made and do make in order to prevent political violence. And something that would be more optimal or more optimized is not yet agreed upon. And that's why we are where we are. Even though
Yes.
even though we all agree it's not optimal.
I think that's correct. It's like, while we don't have it all figured out, we have the best system of government compared to any others, with the understanding that both players in this thought exercise were inherently biased coming in.
All
I
right.
think we did our best to remain objective, but it's very clear that we are shaped by our experiences.
For sure, for sure. And the thing is the idea behind the thought experiment is that like the majority of the society is going to define the society. And since we were brought up in the society, we are the majority of the society. So
Okay,
in a weird Rawlsian way, it works out, even though it is not perfect.
got it.
But yeah, no, the society is definitely unjust for some people, but fixing it is more complicated than at least you and I can figure out.
Yeah, and I think there are more conversations that ought to be had. But yeah, I feel good about where this thought exercise has led us so far.
I'm really mad about it, but thanks for hopping on with me.
Thank you for having me.
Cool. Thanks for your time.
Cheers, my friend. Take care.
So that was us going through the Rawls thought experiment the best that we were able to do. I think a couple of things were interesting to me. The first is that I want to note that political capital exists and may as well be the measure of the public's attention span or ability to think through, or time to think through, or time devoted to thinking through the problems that we face as a society and how we ought best address those problems. I think an hour is good here because it highlights pretty safely the average attention span of an American as they're making decisions about how their government ought to operate. And I can tell you that in this time it has proven impossible to build a consensus system that works better, even while we acknowledge that the system itself does not work very well. I think my conclusion from this is twofold. The first is that Rawls's suggestion or notion that if you were to recreate the government or the society from bottom to top using his original position, that you would recreate what exists today. I think we've proven that that's the case. But I think that it has more to do with inertia than it has to do with whether or not that is a truly just system. We'll continue to read Chapter 2 in the next week of our podcast. I want to again thank our special guest for hopping on here with us. Hopefully we'll have more guests in the future as we continue through the book and have more ideas to unpack or unfold. Thanks again for listening, and I will talk to you next week.